This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Stories influence, teach, and inspire us. But what about the storytellers who create them? Uncorking a Story profiles storytellers to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. It all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin? Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Now here's your host, Mike Carlin.
Well, hello and welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and today I'm excited to reintroduce you to Andrea Bartz. Andrea is a Brooklyn-based journalist and the New York Times bestselling author of the Reese's book club pick, We Were Never Here. Her second thriller, The Herd, was named the best book of 2020 by Real Simple, Marie Claire, Good Housekeeping, CrimeReads, and other outlets. Her LA Times bestselling debut, The Lost Night, was optioned for TV development by Mila Kunis, who I just saw in Black Swan. She joins me today to talk about her latest novel, The Spare Room. Welcome to Uncorking the Story, Andrea.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat again.
I'm excited to have you here too, but remind me, if you will, and the listeners of Uncorking the Story, because there's a bunch of new ones who maybe didn't hear your first interview. Where does your story as an author begin?
So my story as an author begins many, many moons ago at this point. I loved writing fiction and stories when I was a kid. And then in journalism school, I discovered that I really wanted to be a magazine editor. So I forgot all about fiction and graduated with a degree in magazine journalism, moved to New York, and had a career as an editor. And, those who have been paying attention to the magazine industry know that it's not doing super well. And so I kept getting laid off. Places that I worked at kept folding, just ending the magazines. And so when it happened, it was like the third or fourth time back in 2014, 15, something like that. I guess 14. That was when I decided, you know what, I want to work on something that can't be taken away, that I won't walk into work one day and discover that it will no longer, be what I do with my time. So that was the point where I started working on my first manuscript, and that eventually became The Lost Night.
So I have to say, I miss magazines because I used to have, boring ones like Business Week, but also some fun ones. Whenever I get on a plane, it was like I'd love to just sit down and read a magazine, and they're kind of few and far between.
Yeah.
But I also feel your pain because I was the editor-in-chief of an industry publication. And I learned a couple things during that period of my life. Number one, I much more enjoy writing than overseeing every column.
Good to know. Good to know.
which was good insight, but also just the business side of it is, it became a full-time job for me to, and it was a volunteer position for industry, association that I'm part of. But man, I just have so much respect for editors and managing editors and editors-in-chief of the rags, as we used to call them when I worked in advertising.
Yeah, we really cared about putting those magazines into people's hands, and it breaks my heart a little bit that era is over. But now I'm telling stories in a different way. So I can't.
There you go. Well, speaking of stories, what can you share with us about The Spare Room?
Yeah, absolutely. So in The Spare Room, a sort of down on her luck woman moves in with this enchanting couple during the lockdown. She finds herself kind of falling for them, and they open up their marriage for her. And at first, she really loves being a part of this sexy new world. But when she discovers that their last lover is missing, she begins to wonder if they might actually be dangerous and if she might be next. So it's twisty, it's dark, it's sexy. It's a little bit more domestic suspense than the thrillers I've written in the past. And it was inspired in part by my own experiences coming out as bi during the pandemic.
Interesting. Wow, that's big news and a big revelation there. So she's your protagonist is a unicorn. Is that the right term that's used in
I think well, I've been learning all of this too because it's all new to me, but I guess the term is a little bit problematic according to people who've been in the community a lot longer than I.
Sure.
But yeah, I think you could use that term.
Yeah. Now, it's funny. I listened to this podcast. I came across a podcast called Strictly Anonymous, and I had Kathy, who was the host of that, on this show a while ago. One of my most downloaded episodes, probably given the subject matter. But yeah, it was an education in terms that I had never heard before. It's fascinating. So this is a big life-changing moment for you. Happened during the pandemic, it sounds.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I did not become part of a triad myself. I'm not, poly. I'm in a relation, monogamous relationship with a woman. But with this book, we even ended up hiring a sensitivity reader to sort of, look at issues that I wasn't aware of and how I was talking about the poly community and stuff like that. So it was a big education for me as well. So based on firsthand experience and new knowledge for me.
Yeah, interesting. So I like that idea though of having a sensitivity reader, because the last thing you want to do is unintentionally, upset somebody or hurt somebody.
Yeah. I had no intentions of, obviously hurting this community that I was newly a part of. And, in addition, I didn't think about this. I thought it was sort of like, damage control, like preemptive, not taking anyone off. But the process made me realize it was actually an opportunity to really use the book to educate people and, my narrator's journey of learning about what poly means and how it can be done really badly in the case of this, danger-filled triad, all the way to how it can be done correctly. Like her sort of educating herself, hopefully was certainly an education for me, but also is hopefully bringing it into the mainstream for readers too, and having them sort of, learn more about something they might not experience firsthand or know much about.
Did your sensitivity reader find things that were problematic for you?
Absolutely. And it was always stuff I hadn't thought about. I hadn't intended, obviously, anything bad about it, but it was sort of feeding into stereotypes or misconceptions or sort of, using language in a little bit of the wrong way. And then she also, as I said, helped me in a grander sense, sort of underline the narrator's journey and like make it a little bit clearer of not just a journey of sort of sexual awakening and understanding her sexual identity, but also like learning about this community that she is interested in being a part of.
Yeah, I think it's a great way of using fiction to educate people, because we often think of fiction as a way of entertaining people, but it really can be used as a way to educate and shine a light on people, communities who, are maybe misunderstood, certainly, voices who don't have that much amplification in traditional media. So I just talk about that a little bit, kind of using fiction to educate.
Yeah. I mean, this was, I guess, my first and foremost goal is always to entertain. So when people, usually it's more that, someone's asking me about the themes or the messages or what I really want people to take away. And I always have to say, like, first and foremost, like, I am here to have 8 hours fly by as you read this book and to just not be able to stop turning the chapters, which, hopefully I've still accomplished with this book. But I think, yeah, I've always additionally had the goal of working in themes that encourage people to think in a way they haven't before, or perhaps like feel empathy for people that are not like themselves, that they haven't before, or just to understand like different experiences and different ways to react to things, and just sort of getting them to think about what life is like through someone else's shoes, which is sort of empathy is one of our goals in reading, right? There's escapism, but there's also empathy. And then I guess with this, I was intentionally thinking about adding a third E, adding education. And that was because for me, writing it was an education as well. And, I identify as queer now. So those elements of this character who always had thought of herself as straight, she always thought she wanted the husband, the minivan, the 2.5 kids. She is sort of going through this journey of recognizing like, wait a minute, maybe those things that I thought I wanted aren't actually coming from me. Those are coming from outside forces and assumptions and our culture, which is very much echoing the journey that I went through in discovering things about myself. So I was able to sort of tell this own voice's story, but because I am not part of the poly community, it was important for me to learn a lot and get it right and portray that in a sensitive way.
Yeah. Even when we're writing fiction, there's a lot of self-exploration that happens, and we divulge a lot about ourselves onto the page. I remember talking to an author probably this time last year, and she told me that she told me we were having the same conversation. She's telling me, I'm like, "What's your novel about? What can you share with us?" And she tells me this story, and I'm thinking to myself, this is your backstory. I mean, I know this because I knew this about her. And she's like, yeah, well, I only understood these things about myself after I wrote this book. And then she had this like big light bulb moment on. It was kind of cool. I felt it was kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, all of us authors are just processing our own experiences and our own thoughts. And for me, I'm always trying to figure out how I feel about something by writing a book. I choose a topic or a subject that I know I have a lot of feelings about, but they're complicated. I don't have a clear feeling about it. With We Were Never Here, I wasn't totally sure how I felt about like women's safety and women traveling alone and the idea of women, needing to protect themselves. Like, I feel a lot of ways about that. An even more obvious example is The Herd, where, it's sort of a murder mystery set in this bougie, exclusive, all-female co-working space. I had some feelings about corporate feminism and sort of commodified feminism and girl boss culture. And I could really argue both ways. I wasn't totally sure how I felt about it. And to me, not knowing how I feel about it is really tells me that there's going to be enough fuel for the fire for me to explore it and wrestle with it and have a lot of things to say. And I don't think I've ever come out of one of these books with a clear answer, with a definite, like, now this is what I've learned and I can move on. But that for me is very much like jet fuel for getting through the book and propelling the plot and having my character go through this experience that gets them to think about things differently and see things in a new way.
Yeah, I mean, it's an exploration of your own curiosity. And
Absolutely.
if you don't keep following that, then the reader will probably pick up on it too, that, hey, this person just wasn't curious enough about something. I don't know. But it seems like that's I love that term, jet fuel. It's like your curiosity is the jet fuel that propels even the motivation to write.
Yeah, it's like writing is the only way I know how to process things. There are people who, can do it through movement. There's people who can do it through visual media. There's people who can do it through just talking to other people. And I can dabble in those things, but like the only way to really figure out how I feel about something for me is to write about it. It's just, that is how I've always been.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I have a hard time expressing myself verbally most times. So if I need to get into a deep conversation with somebody, and I avoid them like the plague, I do not like confrontation. But I have a much easier time if I sit and write out kind of what I want to say. Now, some people might say that's cheating. You need to talk, in the moment. You need to be an active listener. I'm like, yeah, but this is how I work. This is how I process things. It's how I process my emotions. Because I may not know how I feel in the moment when I'm having a deep conversation, but I know if I take the time to write things through, then I'm in a much better place. There's also like a therapeutic part of that too. It's like
absolutely
getting those emotions out, and there's some kind of catharsis in writing.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure you've also had the experience of free writing about something, whether you're journaling, whether you're trying to write, get your thoughts out intended for a person, where you're totally surprised what comes out of your hands. And you're like, I had no idea that was in there. And that's an experience I have when writing my books as well, where suddenly a theme that I've sort of been, building into it without noticing will just bubble up to the surface. And it's like, oh my God, this is what I'm trying to say. Like, there it is. It's been here all along.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I don't like to spend like an inordinate amount of time outlining things ahead of time. Like I want to know like the beats and where things are going generally, but I love to surprise myself with kind of where things wind up. And I find that I remember once I tried to outline something, I spent like 2 or 3 months just with an outline, a very detailed outline, almost like I was putting together like a nonfiction book proposal.
Yeah.
And then I realized it wasn't a fun writing process either, like after that. But once I realized, hey, you know what? Take a step back, go up to 40,000 feet and then just kind of have a sense of where things are going. But, surprise yourself and explore and get curious and then you're kind of writing it like the reader's reading it. You're kind of discovering
Exactly.
things too, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm not an outliner at all. I have sort of this hook in mind. I have this central, thing I want to explore, and then I'm writing to figure out the answers. I'm writing to figure out what happens next. And I have sort of the headlights in the dark kind of experience of like generally while I'm working on one beat, I start to figure out what the next beat is. But I really don't know beyond that. And so it's terrifying a lot of the time, especially for, thrillers and suspense where they kind of need to work like a Swiss clock. But it's also really exciting when all of a sudden a twist presents itself or something new happens that like, oh my gosh, it makes so much sense. It was totally seeded. I just didn't see it. The irony is that, for me, it's a ton of fun. I'm experiencing it like a reader. I'm so surprised by a reveal or a twist. And then every once in a while, you get a review that's like, this book was so predictable. I saw what was going to happen from the first page. Like nothing about it surprised me. And I'm always like, can I hire you? Like, can you be my plot consultant? Because like, I would love for somebody to have told me where all these things were going when I was just like plowing around in the dark.
Yeah. Yeah. It happens, right? I mean, there's always somebody out there. And I think a lot of those types of reviews are coming from a place of jealousy, to be honest with you.
I
But
do think that as well. Yeah. I think I'm still working on developing my thick skin because I think as writers and creatives, we need to be fairly sensitive and porous. But I do remind myself that yeah, reviews like that are for other readers. They're not for the author, even if they're tagging you in it for some reason. And I think
if they took that active step,
yes, even though they made the decision to add my name to it, so I would see it. But all that said, I think jealousy and insecurity are coming from it. And you know what? Whatever project you haven't written that's in your head, of course it's better than this thing that's on the page, right? So there's this whole idea of like, well, if I had written this, I would have done it so much better. And it's like, but you didn't write it. So I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, I remember talking to somebody once, and I'm a big music guy. We were talking about someone's guitar solo, and they're like, "Yeah, that solo was so predictable. He could have done more." I'm like, "He's the one on stage getting paid to do this, and
Right.
we're sitting here in the audience with earplugs in because we're old." So I'm like, you can have that opinion, but maybe you just don't share it. I don't know.
Right. I mean, it's like all of us like watching the Olympics while we're eating potato chips and being like, oh, she really just didn't stick the landing in that gymnastics routine. It's like, okay,
Right. Well,
let's all remember we have different skill sets. Okay.
Well, yeah. I mean, who's the person who in the Olympics last who had to leave or drop out because of mental health issues?
Yeah.
And she came under so much scrutiny, and I'm like, she's at the pinnacle of her sport.
Truly.
And let's all take a beat here. But
Yeah. Let's applaud her from making that very brave decision for herself.
Yeah. All right. So I always like to get to know my guests a little bit more through not just the writing, but through pop culture. So remind me, Andrea, when you were growing up, favorite TV shows, did you have any?
Favorite TV shows when I was growing up. I always loved spooky things. I was like pretty young when I started watching the X-Files with my parents, and that was just a weekly occurrence. Like hold my calls, it's X-Files night. I loved Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I religiously watched that start to finish, and I was really into, I don't know if anyone remembers this. It was called Erie, Indiana, and it was sort of like one of those precursors to Stranger Things that, is like set in the middle of nowhere and spooky things are happening in a small town. And I remember just really enjoying that. That's one that I think never got a fair shake.
The X-Files is never the wrong answer. I love that show. I watched it till the very, very end, and even some of the movies that came out, even the reboot that came out a couple years ago. I think they did 6 or so episodes. And I remember in one of those, they let David Duchovny be funny. Like they gave him I love to watch him in a humorous role. I mean, Californication was one of my all-time favorite shows.
Yeah, they did an incredible job with that show of like having such tonally different episodes. There were some that were hilarious and like meant to be so. And then there were some that were genuinely terrifying. And it was sort of like you didn't know what you were getting into for each one.
Yeah. How about music? What did you like listening to?
when I was growing up. You specifically mean as a kid?
As a kid, I'd love to know as a kid what the young Andrea was listening to.
My very first CD that I bought, was it a tape or a CD? Let's see. My first album that I remember buying in some form was Weezer's Blue album. Which I still stand, to be clear. And I remember buying the 1994 Grammy nominees CD, and somebody can fact check me, and maybe it was like 95. I think it was 94. It was the best year for music. It had Alanis Morissette, You Ought to Know. It had Kiss from a Rose. It had What If God Was One of Us. It had hit after hit after hit. So I was really into that. My first concert I ever went to was Lauryn Hill with the Black Eyed Peas opening.
Oh, wow. She was with the Fugees, right? Was she in the Fugees?
At the time, she was touring by herself. I think it was the miseducation of Lauryn Hill era, but pretty eclectic. And I think what I listen to is still quite eclectic. It's a little bit of everything, but I definitely am like on here for the 90s, nostalgia trend. And I love hearing Alanis Morissette. Even today, it's never a bad moment when I hear this.
Even though I have to say I hate the song Ironic. There's something about it I just do not like.
Really? I don't think there's a single song on that album that I don't love.
With Jagged Little Pill?
Yeah. That's the one.
It's a great album, and she's certainly, like, when I think of the 90s, you can't not think of Alanis Morissette. That Ironic song just drove me nuts. Couldn't do it. Maybe because none of those things are really ironic. Nothing was ironic, though. They were unfortunate things that happened, but it really wasn't irony. Maybe I'm just being too nerdy about it.
It's true. Syntactically, it was not accurate, but it doesn't matter because it was just so catchy. She wrote songs where all you wanted to do was sing along at the top of your lungs with the choruses. And there was just so many great little moments in it. 10,000 spoons when all you need is a knife. Come on, that's genius.
No, look, okay. You might win me over. I loved You Ought to Know. I used to take a spinning class at I used to work at MasterCard many, many years ago. And we had the spin instructor named Curtis, who had that on one of his one of the playlists. And man, that was a great song to spin to. I
could see that. I mean, yeah, there's just all that anger underneath it, and yeah, that driving beat. I think you could really work out to that.
Yeah. Well, things you've learned about yourself as an author, kind of, going through your own journey. I mean, between, being an editor, working in the magazine business, now, with a few novels, lots of recognition for those novels under your belt. What are some big lessons you've learned about yourself as a novelist?
Yeah, some lessons that I've learned include that I'm not an outliner, which I kept thinking, like, the next book is the one where I'm going to be able to plot it out ahead of time. Because when I'm actually in the middle of writing it and not knowing where I'm going, it's very terrifying, like I said. But I've had to come to accept that is just my process. And what sort of finally clicked into place is that I'm still doing the steps. So every author needs to figure out what their plot is. And plotters do it by writing an outline. They do it by, sitting and listing all those steps out and all the action out before they start writing. And then pantsers like me, those who write by the seat of their pants, we figure it out by writing the first draft and letting it be bad. And when I finally realized, like, okay, I'm not doing something wrong. I'm just like writing my outline by writing, like, in the different way, figuring out the plot by wrestling through it. Then I could sort of liberate myself from berating myself for not starting with everything planned out. And in terms of having the accolades, so my third book, We Were Never Here, was the one that, as you mentioned, was a Reese's book club pick. It was a New York Times bestseller for a number of weeks. And it was really interesting because when I started out as a writer, it was like, if I could just have a book breakout, if I could just hit the list, then I would feel like a writer. Like, then I would know that I'm a real writer. And everything after that would be smooth sailing. Every book idea I pitched, my editors would love. Everything I wrote after that would be a guaranteed success. Like, I just had these ideas that, like, that is the thing that if it happens, everything will change. And not necessarily that I was like saying all those things to myself, but it was just sort of this implicit assumption. And I don't want to sound ungrateful because it did happen. I pulled a winning lottery ticket. And yes, I think I wrote a really good book, but also luck is a part of it. A lot of people wrote really great books that came out that same month. And it was incredible. And it was such a ride. And so many new readers got to experience my words. And that's, totally the dream. And I very much did try to like stop and be like, okay, look around, you're on top of the mountain. That's incredible. But also, wherever you go, there you are. And it turns out your life doesn't completely change. We still had trouble figuring out what my next book was going to be. I still am, kind of flailing about as I start writing book 5. The people whose approval I thought I really cared about, sort of loved ones, where it was like, this is the thing where they're finally going to say, congrats, and like, you've really made it. Like, it didn't come. It didn't happen. And I'm still just me, and I'm still just writing. And it might sound kind of depressing, certainly, and I don't mean for it to be like ungrateful, especially towards those who are just starting out and still have this dream or have been working a lot longer. But I found it really liberating too. It was really freeing to realize that like the goalposts were just going to keep moving. Now it's like, well, why didn't you stay on the list longer? Why didn't your backlist, see a bounce? Why didn't this? So realizing the goalposts are always going to move, and like these outside markers of success are not the thing that makes me a writer. That was really powerful. Like what makes me a writer is that I keep writing, and that I actually do have control over. So until they physically like whip my keyboard out from under my fingers, I'm going to keep writing books. And it would be amazing if another one, took off. But even if not, that is what I'm going to keep doing. And that's what makes me a writer, not this external stuff that's pretty out of my control.
You mentioned something interesting, which was, you used the term, we had a hard time figuring out what the next book was going to be or the next idea was going to be. Who's the we there? Because I'm thinking, hey, you're the writer. Isn't it you who's coming up with that? Or is there like a collaborative element there?
There's definitely a collaborative element for me. I don't know what it's like for every other author, but in my case, I have worked with the same agent and editor for all of my books. I signed with my agent in 2016, and she sold the book to my editor in 2017. So it's been a long time working with these people, and I trust them a lot. And they both have sort of speaking of 40,000 foot views, they have a sense of my career, what my readers want, what makes a book an Andrea Bartz thriller that I'm a little bit too close to see. And so I'm the one pitching book ideas, and I'm the one saying, here's what I'm interested in writing. But they both kind of have, I don't know about veto power, but I really value their feedback. And I think, I could make the decision that if my editor said, I just don't think that's the right next book for you, I could say, well, I don't care. It's what I want to write. But I don't, because I really trust them. And I am doing this as a job. I want to be commercially successful and not just be writing these beautiful books that are of my heart, but that nobody reads. So in my case, it is collaborative of all of us sort of agreeing that this is like the right next book for me.
When you were taking a trip back in time to 2016, or even, preparing for that first book to be sold, did you have that same belief that this was going to be a collaborative process? Or did you think, this really is up to me, and I don't need anyone else to help there?
I knew that I needed, so I had come to understand that a good agent is sort of like a manager. They're managing your career. And so, I selected one who had an amazing track record, and her other clients had different wonderful things to say about her. And so I felt like I was in good hands with her, but I guess I didn't yet know. I knew I wanted to be commercially viable. And so that was something that I, could express was important to me, that, I was not looking to write, given the two options, I don't want to be Donna Tartt. I want to be Gillian Flynn. You know what I mean? Like I could express those things of like, here's how I see my book being marketed. And that said, I just sort of thought I needed to stay in the genre. So I pitched a book once I had sold and sort of wrapped up edits on the last night. I wrote a whole sample and outline back when I thought I could do outlines. I did a whole synopsis of a second book that was a murder mystery that felt very close to my heart, and it involved, some of my own kind of childhood trauma and things. It was set within this like very conservative evangelical, parochial school where stuff was bubbling below the surface, and in the Midwest. So there were definitely elements of myself in it, and I just thought it's a murder mystery. Like, great, that's all we need. And my editor was the one who was like, I think what makes your books about you is that there's like a cool girl element. There's like this sort of aspirational, interesting women, interesting, ambitious, smart women doing interesting, smart, ambitious things that we should continue as a through line, because that's what people are going to look for. And she's like, I'm just kind of not seeing it in this story of, a man and a woman in this church and school setting in Wisconsin. And she was 100% right, but that blew my mind. I did not even realize that there was a through line yet. And so since then, that sort of made me really realize that I don't necessarily know what an Andrea Bartz thriller is. I'm getting better at figuring it out, but like, that is a very clear line for my agent, and especially for my editor. She's just phenomenal at that. And so, yeah, I've sort of learned to trust them more and more, and learned like what they're capable of in terms of recognizing what's the right next step for me.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of people think of authors, writers, that it's a solitary process. And, make no mistake, that a lot of it is time spent by yourself, but there is a lot of collaboration that happens for, bestsellers such as yourself.
Absolutely. I mean, to give one example, I had a call last week with my agent and editor to go over the first. I'd sent them like 25,000 words of my next book, book 5. And they had a lot of things to say about what was working and what wasn't working and where I should go with it. But then at the end of the call, I was like, oh, my deadline in the contract is like October, and that's really soon. And they were like, oh yeah, you can take like a year. Does that work? You can send it in like a year. So just think about that. Think about getting a deadline a year from now. And until then, like, they don't expect to hear anything about this book.
Right.
So that's me time. That's just me solitary in a room with a keyboard trying to figure out this next stupid book.
Well, I wouldn't call it a stupid book, but
while I'm working on it, I hate it at times.
Okay,
so
well, there you go.
Those are the moments.
That's right. Then it is work, right? Then it equals work.
Absolutely.
Well, exciting. This is great. I know The Spare Room is coming out in June. This episode will be, for those listening, The Spare Room is probably already out.
June 20th. If it's after June 20th, then it is on shelves now, wherever books are sold.
There we go. And Andrea, if there are social media handles you want to share with the listeners, if they want to follow you anywhere?
Yeah, absolutely. I love connecting with readers. My website is andreabartz.com, and I am on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram at Andy Bartz, ANDIBARTZ. I'm also on Facebook, although I use that less. That's at Andrea Bartz Author. So I would love to hear from people.
So you're doing the TikTok, huh?
On and off. I've been on less of a kick lately, but I share a lot of writing tips on it and sort of insight and advice for the industry and surviving this wild publishing journey. So if that's interesting to you, then you might enjoy my TikTok.
There you go. Well, I'll put all of those handles in the show notes so people can easily find them. Andrea, thank you for stopping by Uncorking Story and letting me uncork yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Mike.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.